Hey guys, welcome to Dreamless Timelines. If you're new here, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and maybe pour yourself a cup of tea, though preferably not too sweet. Because tonight, we're talking about molasses. Yes, molasses. The thick, syrupy goo your grandmother might have used exactly once in a cookie recipe and then shoved to the back of the pantry for eternity. But in 1919, in Boston, molasses wasn't some quiet pantry item. It was a business, a big, sticky, lucrative business that, thanks to one impressively bad decision after another, turned into one of the slowest, weirdest disasters in American history. This, my friends, is the story of the Great Molasses Flood. And no, that's not a joke headline from The Onion. It was real. It killed people. It destroyed buildings. It confused horses. And it left Boston smelling like a failed bakery for months. So let's ease into it, slowly, like molasses itself. Picture it. January 15th, 1919, Boston's North End. It's noonish, and the temperature has just warmed up after a stretch of cold weather. Kids are out playing, a few workers are unloading cargo nearby, horses are clip-clopping along the cobblestone streets, and standing in the middle of it all is a giant steel tank, about 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, filled to the brim with molasses. If you're wondering why on earth anyone would need that much molasses, well, thank the rum business. Molasses was the key ingredient for industrial alcohol production, which was then used to make munitions during World War I, and, more importantly, rum. Because even when the world is at war, apparently someone has to keep the bars running. The company responsible for this sweet monstrosity was United States Industrial Alcohol, or USIA for short, and the tank itself was operated by their subsidiary, the Purity Distilling Company, which, spoiler alert, was neither pure nor particularly good at distilling safety protocols. The tank had been built in 1915, and from the very beginning, locals noticed something concerning. Specifically, it leaked. Yes, the tank was already leaking molasses before it even reached full capacity. Kids in the neighborhood used to bring cups and collect the syrup that dripped down the sides, like some kind of industrial candy fountain. And the company? Their solution was to paint the tank brown so the leaks would be less noticeable. Because obviously when your storage tank is leaking an ocean of sugar syrup, the real issue is aesthetics. Now, by 1919, this tank was holding over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, enough to fill about 3.5 Olympic swimming pools. It was heavy, under pressure, and structurally, well, questionable would be generous. Then came the weather shift. Cold molasses contracts, warm molasses expands. That morning, the temperature had jumped by nearly 40 degrees in a few hours, meaning all that sticky goodness inside the tank started pushing hard against its metal shell. And at 12:30 p.m., with a deep rumbling sound and a metallic groan that echoed through the neighborhood, the tank burst. Witnesses later said it sounded like a machine gun firing, rapid, sharp cracks as the rivets tore loose. Then came the wave, a 25-foot-high wall of molasses moving at about 35 miles per hour, which doesn't sound fast until you remember it's molasses. This was syrup moving with the speed of a car. Buildings were instantly flattened. A steel support for the nearby elevated train track twisted like a paperclip. Horses were trapped and drowned. People, too. Some couldn't run fast enough. Others were knocked down and suffocated under the sticky mass. In total, 21 people died, and around 150 were injured. The flood covered several blocks. It swept away homes, wagons, even parts of the firehouse. And then, as fast as it came, it stopped. Just syrup everywhere. Shiny, brown, and disturbingly quiet. The first rescuers who arrived didn't even know what they were walking into. Firefighters tried to wade through it, but every step was a fight. Boots got sucked in. Horses couldn't move. And it wasn't just thick, it was sticky. Anyone who touched it got coated in molasses, which then hardened in the cold night air. One policeman said it was like trying to walk through a field of glue. Another described the scene as like drowning in caramel. Cleanup started almost immediately, but that word, cleanup, doesn't really do justice to what came next. They brought in salt water from the harbor to try and wash it away. They used sand to absorb it. They even scraped molasses off the streets with shovels. Every building, every brick, every shoe was coated. Molasses had seeped into basements, under doors, into sewers. Even the rats didn't want to touch it. And then came the smell. For weeks, Boston reeked of sugar and decay. The city turned into one giant, sticky dessert. People tracked molasses everywhere, on sidewalks, into trolleys, onto doorknobs. And because molasses dissolves in water, every time it rained, the smell came back. One local resident later said, for decades after, on hot days you could still smell it. Decades. Imagine being stuck with the scent of burnt candy for 30 years. So, who was to blame? Naturally, the company said, not us. They first blamed anarchists, because that was the go-to excuse for everything in 1919. Apparently, it was easier to believe that political radicals had bombed a molasses tank than to admit you'd built it out of the world's cheapest steel. But public outrage was spreading faster than the syrup had. So investigations began. Enter the engineers, the lawyers, and the insurance adjusters, a group of people who, ironically, managed to make this disaster even more tedious. The cleanup had barely finished when the lawsuits started. More than 100 lawsuits were filed against the company. It became the longest civil case in Massachusetts history up to that point, lasting nearly 6 years. 6 years of molasses-related legal arguments. Imagine sitting in court day after day, listening to lawyers say things like, Your Honor, the viscosity of the syrup was approximately. They brought in expert witnesses, metallurgists, chemists, and structural engineers. They examined the rivets, the steel plates, even the company memos. Turns out the tank steel was too thin, about half the recommended thickness. And no, it had never been properly tested for leaks. The man who oversaw construction had no engineering background. He just, it'll be fine. The trial uncovered even more absurd details. When workers complained about hearing creaks and groans from the tank, management shrugged it off. When molasses began seeping out, they painted over it instead of fixing it. And when the tank finally burst, company executives were shocked. Shocked, I tell you, that something so unexpected could happen. It was one of those rare moments where bureaucracy accidentally documented its own incompetence in perfect clarity. Meanwhile, engineers conducted a detailed structural analysis, the kind that could put even an insomniac to sleep. They concluded that the steel contained too little manganese, making it brittle, and the rivets, poorly fitted, many already cracking. One expert said the tank was a disaster waiting to happen, which is historian speak for, who idiot approved this? The final report ran hundreds of pages, describing in excruciating detail how exactly molasses stress-tested industrial negligence. The conclusion was simple. The company was at fault. In 1925, USIA was ordered to pay $628,000 in damages, about $10 million today. Families of the victims received around $7,000 each, depending on the case. Which, yes, feels small for being crushed by syrup, but at least it was something. And yet what's truly fascinating isn't the disaster itself, but the slow, sticky aftermath. It changed how engineers designed large storage tanks. It led to better building codes and mandatory safety inspections. Basically, Boston's Molasses mess helped make modern industrial safety law just a bit less terrible. So, in the end, the Great Molasses Flood wasn't just a bizarre footnote in history. It was a very sweet, very slow, very tragic turning point. But tonight, as we drift a little deeper into this syrupy tale, let's pause here. Because next, we're going to float, slowly, into what happened after Boston finally got clean again. The politics, the corporate denials, and the surprisingly poetic ways people remembered the flood. So settle in, we're just getting started.
Hey again, sleepy historians. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've survived part 1 without getting stuck. We left Boston knee-deep in syrup, surrounded by twisted metal and angry insurance men. Now, let's settle back, take a slow breath, and wander through the aftermath, because the flood may have ended, but the stickiness had just begun. After the cleanup teams finally realized you can't just hose down a city, Boston entered a kind of molasses purgatory. Everything looked vaguely shiny. Every surface felt just a bit tacky. And for weeks, the air was thick with the scent of spoiled sugar and salt water. Locals complained that even after multiple scrubbings, their clothes still smelled like a wet gingerbread man. Street sweepers reported their brooms sticking to the ground, and one harbor patrol officer swore that the water near the wharf shimmered with a thin layer of brown syrup for months. Fish didn't come near the area, birds avoided landing on the docks. Basically, Boston had turned into a sticky ghost town. Meanwhile, the press had an absolute field day. Newspapers described it as a tidal wave of death, the syrupy disaster, and my personal favorite, Boston's brown plague. You could almost hear the headlines being written by people who couldn't decide if they should laugh or cry. Editorial cartoons showed molasses tanks exploding like champagne bottles. Some joked that Boston was finally sweet on something. Dark humor, perhaps, but in 1919, that was pretty standard coping. The company, United States Industrial Alcohol, immediately went into damage control mode. Their lawyers insisted it was sabotage, because apparently there were anarchists lurking in every alleyway, just waiting to blow up a molasses tank. This was 1919, after all. The Red Scare was in full swing. Workers were striking, bombs had gone off in government offices, and rich businessmen were getting nervous. So when USIA's lawyers claimed foreign radicals had attacked their facility, people were inclined to believe them, at least the people who didn't live next to the tank. The residents of Boston's North End, mostly Italian immigrants, weren't having it. They'd been complaining about the tank for years. They'd heard the groans, the rattles, the occasional ominous dripping. If you lived on Commercial Street, you knew the sound of molasses leaking like you knew the church bells on Sunday. So when the company blamed anarchists, the locals basically said, "Nice try, but no." The city began its own investigation, and so did the Massachusetts Superior Court. This wasn't just about one tank. It was about corporate responsibility in a time when that phrase meant almost nothing. The hearings were held in a makeshift courtroom inside Boston's old courthouse, and every day people lined up outside to watch what was quickly being called the Molasses case. Imagine it, hundreds of witnesses, boxes of photographs, structural blueprints, and somewhere in there, a discussion about the flow rate of sugar syrup. It was like watching C-SPAN if C-SPAN was narrated by Winnie the Pooh. Let's talk about the judge for a second. Hugh W. Ogden, a patient man. He heard the case for over 3 years, often 5 days a week, sometimes all day. By the end, he'd listened to over 1,500 witnesses and read more than 25,000 pages of testimony. If you ever need an example of dedication or the world's longest sugar hangover, Judge Ogden is your man. During the hearings, company executives testified that the tank was built according to the best practices of the time, which, considering it had never been pressure tested and leaked constantly, was a chilling sentence. One engineer described how the steel was too brittle to handle temperature changes. Another pointed out that the rivets used to hold the tank together were, how do we say this nicely, garbage. Apparently they'd been made of inferior material and had shown early signs of cracking. But sure, why not replace them? What could go wrong? The court also heard from dozens of North End residents. Their testimonies were vivid and, honestly, heartbreaking. A man described seeing the brown wave sweep through the street, carrying a horse like a leaf. A woman said her husband was swallowed in seconds, as if the street itself had turned to glue. One firefighter told the court he spent an entire night trying to dig a man out with his bare hands, only to realize he was kneeling in molasses so thick he couldn't even move his arms. Even after the cleanup, the emotional residue lingered. Families couldn't return home for weeks. Furniture was ruined. Walls were stained. And every breeze from the harbor carried that same sweet, sour scent, a constant reminder of the day everything literally went to syrup.
The case dragged on and on. At one point, the company tried to argue that the explosion had been caused by fermentation gases inside the tank. Basically, their defense was, the molasses exploded itself. An interesting take. Science said no. Experts recreated small-scale tests, measuring gas buildup and pressure levels. Turns out you'd need conditions closer to a brewery on fire to make molasses self-combust. The data clearly pointed back to weak steel and bad design. Still, USIA's lawyers clung to their sabotage theory until the bitter, sticky end. Because nothing says corporate accountability like blaming invisible anarchists. While all this was unfolding, Boston became something of a national joke. Papers in Chicago, New York, and London ran mocking pieces about Boston's sticky situation. People made puns for years, and yes, someone actually wrote a song about it, though thankfully it never topped the charts. But for locals, it wasn't funny, especially not for the Italian immigrant community, which had been hit the hardest. Many of the victims were poor laborers or children, and their families faced not just grief, but discrimination during the legal process. Some English-speaking witnesses were prioritized. Others had to testify through translators who struggled to capture what they saw. The flood didn't just reveal flaws in engineering, it exposed the social cracks of the city itself. Finally, in 1925, Judge Ogden released his ruling. USIA was entirely responsible. His written decision was 51 pages long, meticulous, calm, and absolutely devastating for the company. He concluded that the tank's steel was substandard, the design untested, and the maintenance negligent. In other words, it wasn't sabotage, it wasn't gas, it was just good old-fashioned corporate corner-cutting. USIA was ordered to pay nearly $1 million in damages, a massive sum at the time. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $17 million today. Most of the money went to victims' families, with smaller amounts to local businesses for property damage. It was the first time in U.S. history that a major corporation had been held legally liable for an industrial accident of this scale. So yes, the Great Molasses Flood became a turning point, not in disaster prevention, but in responsibility. And then Boston moved on. Slowly. Literally and metaphorically. By the late 1920s, the site of the tank had been cleared. A city park eventually replaced it. Langone Park, where people now play baseball and sunbathe, blissfully unaware that they're standing on ground once soaked in syrup. Today there's just a small plaque marking the event. It reads in simple letters, "On January 15, 1919, a molasses tank burst, causing a flood that killed 21 people." That's it. No drama, no adjectives, just a quiet line acknowledging one of the strangest tragedies in American history. But Boston never really forgot. Even a century later, locals swear the smell still lingers on hot summer days. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter. It's become part of the folklore. The molasses flood became shorthand for bureaucratic incompetence, lazy engineering, and the idea that, yes, even something as harmless as syrup can kill you if you cut enough corners. So, the next time you're pouring molasses, or honey, or whatever sweetener you've convinced yourself is healthy, take a second to imagine it moving through the streets like a slow brown avalanche. Because history, it turns out, can be sticky in more ways than one. We'll pause here, because in Part 3, we'll drift further down the syrupy timeline into how this single event reshaped American industry, inspired safety laws, and became an oddly comforting bedtime story about human folly. So lie back, let the sweetness fade, and we'll pick up, slowly, right where we left off. Welcome back, you syrup scholars. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've officially outlasted the molasses. So far, we've seen Boston drown in sugar, lawyers swim through paperwork, and one very tired judge declare that yes, maybe, just maybe, building a giant tank without testing it wasn't a great idea. Now, let's float gently through what happened after the dust and the syrup settled. Because the Great Molasses Flood didn't just end in 1925 with a payout and a park. It rippled quietly through American industry for decades. It changed the way engineers thought. It even influenced the way governments handled safety. All from one badly built tank of sticky brown goo. Let's start with the obvious. Boston had to rebuild. The North End, already one of the city's oldest neighborhoods, was battered and resentful. Most of the destroyed homes and businesses were rebuilt with compensation money, but the emotional mess took longer. For years, locals would point at Commercial Street and say, "That's where it happened." Parents warned their kids not to play near the harbor. "You don't want to get stuck again." And, in the collective memory of the city, the flood became less of a tragedy and more of a cautionary bedtime story. This is what happens when you ignore the leaks. You know, the kind of story every city needs at least one of. Meanwhile, engineers were having an existential crisis. The molasses tank collapse exposed just how casually early 20th century companies treated large-scale construction. No blueprints had been approved, no calculations verified, no safety inspections performed. Basically, the whole thing ran on vibes. In the years that followed, civil engineers started pushing for standardized building codes. By the mid-1920s, Massachusetts had introduced stricter requirements for pressure vessels and liquid storage. Soon after, other states copied the idea. And in 1928, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME, introduced something that probably sounds boring but has saved a lot of lives: the Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code.
It established rules for how thick steel should be, how rivets should be tested, and how every industrial tank, no matter what it held, water, gas, or molasses, should be inspected regularly. So, ironically, the Great Molasses Flood gave birth to one of the most important engineering safety standards in modern history. You could even say it laid the foundation for industrial accountability. A sweet legacy, if you don't think too hard about the deaths. The insurance industry also got a sticky wake-up call. Before the flood, most companies insured structures based on general estimates. No one was checking welds or pressure tolerances. Afterward, insurers started sending actual engineers to inspect major storage tanks before approval. The phrase risk assessment became more than a checkbox, because when one tank failure costs you nearly $1 million in claims and public humiliation, you start caring about metallurgy real fast. And then there's the public memory. If you were in Boston in the 1930s or 40s, you might have noticed something odd. No one really talked about the flood anymore. It wasn't covered in school history lessons, no monuments, no annual remembrances. Part of that was shame. Boston had been mocked so relentlessly by newspapers around the world that for decades the city preferred to pretend it never happened. A sticky embarrassment, as one historian later put it. The flood only resurfaced in the 1960s, when a few local researchers started digging through old records. They found courtroom transcripts, engineering notes, and photos of the aftermath that looked more like a chocolate apocalypse than an industrial accident. That's when the myth of the molasses wave began to take on a new life. Less tragedy, more folklore. And oh, what a myth it became!
Over the decades, the story evolved in the telling. The molasses wave got taller, the speed got faster, the smell lasted longer. By the time modern retellings came around, you'd think Boston had faced a caramel tsunami that swallowed the city whole. Reality check, the wave was about 25 feet high at its peak, moved around 35 miles per hour, and the smell lingered for months, not decades. But we humans love a good exaggeration, especially when it involves dessert. Let's talk about something surprisingly beautiful, how people remembered it emotionally. There's a strange tenderness in how survivors described those moments afterward. Not fear, not rage, just disbelief. One man, a firefighter named George Leahy, said years later, "It was as though time slowed down. Everything moved thick and heavy." That's probably literal, but also poetic. Another survivor said the silence after the tank burst was worse than the sound of it. It was quiet, she said. Too quiet for something that big. Even in the archives, there's this surreal calm to the eyewitness accounts, almost as if the disaster itself was too absurd to process emotionally. Then there's the smell. Ah, yes, the eternal molasses smell. Even 50 years later, people living in the North End claimed that on hot summer days, when the humidity rose just right, you could catch a faint whiff of sweetness in the air. Old-timers swore it wasn't their imagination. Scientists would probably say otherwise. But honestly, it's kind of comforting to imagine the city still carrying that sugary ghost. Some historians even call it the Boston's phantom scent. And that's the kind of phrase that makes history feel alive, in a weird, sticky way. Now, here's a little irony. For decades, no one could even agree on where exactly the tank stood. By the 1950s, the area had been redeveloped so many times that the original coordinates were lost. It wasn't until 2014 that historians used old maps, building blueprints, and photographs to pinpoint the exact location. Today, a small circular plaque sits there near the baseball field at Langone Park. Kids play Little League over the spot where the tank once stood. No one notices. No one thinks about the 2.3 million gallons that once turned this field into a syrup lagoon. History, like molasses, tends to sink to the bottom if you don't stir it. As the decades rolled on, the story found new life in pop culture. Documentaries, children's books, even science shows have covered it. The Discovery Channel once did a slow-motion recreation of the flood using syrup substitutes. Historians have analyzed it as a case study in fluid dynamics. Yes, Molasses flood physics is a real paper. And every few years, around January 15th, local journalists write anniversary pieces titled things like Boston's Sweetest Disaster or A Sticky Lesson in Corporate Negligence. The tone always wobbles between tragic and amused, because that's what the Great Molasses Flood became over time. A gentle, ironic reminder that sometimes history's strangest stories are the slowest moving ones. Let's talk about legacy for a moment. The flood didn't just reshape laws or inspire books, it changed how people thought about progress itself. In 1919, industry was booming. Steel, chemicals, alcohol, all symbols of modernity. And then a tank full of syrup reminded everyone that progress, without accountability, can turn deadly in a heartbeat. That theme still echoes today. Every time a company cuts safety corners or a structure fails because of ignored warnings, people bring up the molasses flood. Usually in phrases like, "This is our generation's great molasses flood," which admittedly sounds more fun than massive negligence lawsuit. The flood has also seeped, pun intended, into the cultural imagination as one of those "it's so absurd it must be true" stories. People love it for the contrast. How could something so slow, so harmless, be so destructive? It's almost philosophical. There's a quiet lesson buried under the syrup, that even the gentlest substances can become unstoppable when pressure builds, that small leaks ignored long enough can bring down giants, and that sometimes the disasters we laugh about are the ones we should have seen coming. Today, if you walk through Boston's North End on a calm evening, you might pass the playground, see the plaque, and never know what happened there. The park is peaceful now. No smell, no stain. Just families picnicking, joggers passing by, maybe someone eating a sandwich that's just a little too sweet. But if you know the story, you can almost picture it. The slow, unstoppable tide of brown syrup glinting in the winter sun. And the lesson still holds a century later. Even molasses moves fast when you build your tank too thin. So as you drift off tonight, think of Boston, not the bustling modern one, but the one that once spent a whole year scraping syrup out of its streets. A city that learned, quite literally, the value of structural integrity. And maybe, in a quiet way, that's comforting. Because history, no matter how messy, always finds a way to clean itself up. Eventually. So as you drift off tonight, think of Boston. Not the bustling modern one, but the one that once spent a whole year scraping syrup out of its streets. A city that learned, quite literally, the value of structural integrity. And maybe, in a quiet way, that's comforting. Because history, no matter how messy, always finds a way to clean itself up. Eventually. Let's float now, slowly, of course, to another tale of sticky disaster. Because, as it turns out, Boston wasn't the first, nor the last, to be swallowed by something sweet. This one takes us to Italy, to a little place called Modica, in Sicily. And instead of molasses, it was chocolate. Yes, actual chocolate. In 1902, a chocolate factory explosion sent waves of cocoa sludge through the streets. Locals said the air smelled like heaven and regret. And, in classic Italian fashion, people still showed up the next morning to complain about taxes. Unlike Boston, Modica's chocolate flood didn't make it into every newspaper. Maybe because no one really wanted to complain about free chocolate. But the cleanup? Still awful. Cocoa hardens fast. And once it mixed with dust and rubble, it turned into a kind of urban brownie that no one wanted to eat.
Let's glide forward a few decades. Different country, different syrup, same human error. 1943, Northern England. A factory producing treacle, a cousin of molasses, burst open after a boiler failure. Workers were lucky. Most escaped with only minor burns, but the nearby canal, it looked like a cup of oversteeped tea. The British, ever calm about disaster, described it as a bit of a bother, and then quietly spent weeks shoveling congealed treacle off cobblestones while pretending everything was fine. Disasters like these share one strange quality. They're not dramatic, not explosive in the way we imagine catastrophe. They're slow. They seep. They remind us that sometimes ruin doesn't come crashing down, it just seeps quietly into your shoes. And yet, there's something oddly human about it. We build things too fast. We skip the tests. We trust the steel, the rivets, the promise that it'll probably hold. Then, when it doesn't, we stand around staring at the mess like, well, that's unfortunate. Boston, Modica, Yorkshire, different languages, same sigh. Let's drift for a moment to the people who had to live through it. Not the factory owners or the lawyers, but the regular folks, the janitors, the mothers, the tram drivers, who woke up one day to find the street outside looked like dessert gone wrong. In Boston, a man named Patrick Donovan said he could smell molasses for years afterward. He'd walk past Commercial Street and swear the air still felt heavy, like it hadn't quite forgiven the past. Children, born years later, grew up with stories of the sweet flood as if it were folklore. Some even said on hot summer days the ground still oozed. Science says that's probably not true, but maybe the memory just fermented, the way old sugar does. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Great Molasses Flood. Not just a structural failure, but a reminder that cities, like people, carry their pasts in strange, sticky ways. Let's sink deeper, shall we? To the quieter ripples it left behind. Because even after the last lawsuit closed, the last photograph filed away, Boston didn't just move on. It changed. Building codes became stricter. Tanks now required engineering oversight. Companies could no longer say, "Trust us, it's fine." And though no one really thanked the molasses for it, that disaster quietly helped shape modern safety laws. So next time you walk past an industrial tank or a shiny factory wall, remember, someone, somewhere, once paid dearly for that reassurance. And if tonight's history lesson has made you just a little sleepy, well, that's how Boston probably felt too, after wading through 2 million gallons of regret. Boston never forgot. How could it? For years, every mention of molasses made people sigh like they'd just remembered a bad date. But while the smell eventually faded, the paperwork didn't. And that, dear listener, might be the most 20th century sentence ever spoken. After the trials ended in the mid-1920s, the Great Molasses Flood became required reading for lawyers, engineers, and bored bureaucrats who needed an example of why testing things is good. The court ruling had been clear. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or as everyone now called them, those molasses guys, was responsible. Negligence, poor construction, zero oversight. But beyond the blame game, something more subtle began to happen. The world started caring about how things were built, not just what they were made of. Engineers, newly embarrassed, began talking about load testing. The term sounds thrilling, but it's really just, let's make sure this won't explode when full. Before 1919,
Tanks like the one in Boston were often built by eye, as in, someone literally eyeballed the rivet pattern and said, "Yeah, looks sturdy." Spoiler, it wasn't. After the flood, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers quietly updated their standards. No more eyeballing. From then on, every large container holding liquids under pressure had to be certified, inspected, and rechecked. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a bedtime story, dull, necessary, and oddly comforting. Boston's City Council also got busy. They introduced new inspection ordinances, required official building permits, and finally gave engineers legal authority over industrial safety. In a way, that molasses tank didn't just collapse a wall, it collapsed an entire era of casual construction. And while the public moved on, engineers didn't. They cited the flood in classrooms for decades. Civil engineering professors loved it. It had everything: math errors, corporate arrogance, physics failure. Basically, the holy trinity of "don't do this." Let's glide to the insurance world for a moment, because as it turns out, they had an awakening, too. Before 1919, insurance adjusters mostly dealt with fires, shipwrecks, or suspicious lightning accidents. Molasses floods weren't in the manual. So they had to invent a whole new category called industrial fluid containment failure, which sounds boring, and it is, but it quietly changed how industrial risk was calculated forever. Premiums went up. Safety audits became a thing. And by the 1930s, most factories had at least one guy whose entire job was to say, "Are you sure that won't burst?" A small victory for humanity, courtesy of Boston's stickiest disaster. And then there's the cultural side. Boston rebuilt, repaved, repainted, but the story never quite left. It became one of those local legends, half tragedy, half punchline. Kids heard it at bedtime, tour guides turned it into trivia, and every January, newspapers ran the same nostalgic headline: "On this day, Boston got sweeter." Except, of course, it didn't. The flood wasn't sweet. It was hot, crushing, suffocating. But humans have a strange way of softening memory, adding sugar where pain once was. Maybe that's why we tell it so calmly now, like a bedtime fable for grown-ups, a reminder that even disasters can become gentle if you wait long enough. By the late 1930s, the Great Molasses Flood had faded into textbooks. World War II had bigger explosions, bigger messes. But deep down, engineers still whispered about that tank. It was their ghost story, a cautionary tale told in low voices. Remember to check your rivets, or Boston will haunt you. And so, as we wrap up this long, slow tale of syrup and steel, maybe it's worth thinking about what the molasses really left behind. Not just the stains on the streets, but the quiet lessons in patience, responsibility, and humility. It's strange, isn't it, that something so sweet could leave behind such bitter wisdom. History has a way of doing that, of sticking to you long after the story ends. So, if you're still awake, congratulations, you've survived one of history's slowest disasters. And if you're drifting off, well, let the city of Boston hum softly in your dreams. A city that learned, quite literally, that even sweetness can drown you. A century has passed. Boston has changed. The docks are quieter, the skyline taller, and the only thing flowing down Commercial Street now is traffic and tourists. But if you walk slowly, say on a cool January morning, you might still feel something there, something faint, sweet, and a little sad. They say the smell is gone, but people still talk about it as if it lingers, somewhere between memory and myth. And maybe it does. Because places, like people, never really forget their most embarrassing moments. They just learn to tell the story better. In 2019, Boston quietly marked the 100th anniversary of the Great Molasses Flood. There were no fireworks, of course, too ironic. Just a small ceremony near the old North End site. A few historians, city officials, and curious locals gathered. Someone read out the names of the 21 victims. Someone else mentioned how the city had finally forgiven the syrup. There's even a little plaque now. It stands not far from where the tank once loomed. It's simple, almost shy. It reads, "On January 15, 1919, a molasses tank exploded at this site. 21 people were killed, many others injured. The accident led to stricter construction laws and industrial safety standards." And that's it. No dramatics, no syrup jokes, just quiet respect. Almost like the city itself learned to speak softly about the things that once made it loud. The area today is unrecognizable. The docks have turned into office buildings, parking lots, and polished cafes with names like the Sugar Bowl and Harbor Suite. Tourists wander by, snapping photos, never realizing the pavement underfoot was once a river of boiling molasses. Sometimes locals mention it, just casually. "Oh yeah, that's where the molasses flood happened." Then they shrug, sip their coffee, and carry on. It's funny how time does that. It smooths over tragedy until it fits neatly into small talk. A disaster becomes an anecdote becomes trivia, and trivia becomes the background hum of history. Yet every few years, the story bubbles back up. In podcasts, documentaries, or yes, sleepy YouTube monologues like this one. Because there's something oddly comforting about the molasses flood. It's not a war, not a fire, not a plague. It's just human error turned syrupy. Tragic, but absurd enough to make you sigh instead of shudder. And in that way, it's perfect bedtime history. Slow, sticky, quietly meaningful. Some engineers still visit the site as a kind of pilgrimage, not out of guilt, but reverence. For them, it's not about sugar at all. It's about accountability, the idea that a single collapsed tank can rewrite how the world builds its future. They'll stand there, look at the plaque, and think, all this because someone didn't test the pressure. It's humbling, and maybe a little sweet. Every January, newspapers still print the same photo: the collapsed steel, the ruined train tracks, the horse carts sunk halfway into brown sludge. It looks almost surreal, like a sepia dream that never quite dissolved. And under the image, the same headline appears again and again: Boston's sweetest disaster. Except now, it's not just about tragedy. It's a reminder of progress, of learning the hard way, of the fact that sometimes even the slowest, strangest accidents push the world forward. So, as we finally close this long, syrupy chapter, let's take one last slow breath together. Think of the molasses, heavy and dark, rolling quietly through the streets a century ago. Think of the people who cleaned it up, the engineers who learned from it, and the city that carried it still does in some invisible way. Boston survived. It rebuilt, and eventually the world followed its lead. Maybe that's the real sweetness left behind. Not in the sugar, but in the way humans keep fixing what they break, slowly, clumsily, and always with the faint hope that next time we'll do it better. So now, as the night settles in and your eyes get heavy, remember, not every disaster needs to be loud to be remembered. Some just seep quietly into history. And somewhere beneath the modern city, Boston still dreams of the day it finally dried. Good night, and may your walls stay solid, your rivets tight, and your stories just sweet enough to sleep on.